Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode. In this presentation, as we continue to go through Scott Adams' Win Bigly book, we're going to talk about confirmation bias and the 2016 election. Now, confirmation bias is basically the brain's automatic reflex to interpret any new information as being supportive of the opinions it already holds. And as far as persuasion goes, you have to recognize that we're all afflicted by confirmation bias all the time. Now, the reason why our brains do this is once again has to do with evolution. The only thing evolution cares about is surviving in order to procreate. Whether we understand things rationally is quite irrelevant. So, yeah, there we go. So basically, if our brains were constantly reevaluating new information as it comes in, that would take a lot of energy for not very much benefit. Therefore, our brains essentially kind of take the shortest route and to basically to kind of confirm what we already think to be true. So yeah, essentially our brains essentially take the path of least resistance. So if you have so that's why it can be so hard to change someone's already pre-existing belief into a new belief, particularly when it's emotionally held. So once again, we're not rational. One recent example of this that was quite popular, or that got a lot of play on social media, was what I call the global warming polar bear, where a group, an environmental group, that definitely cares about climate change, found this bear that was quite sick, took a picture of it and said, this is the kind of thing we can expect to happen, or happen more as climate change supposedly happens, which is, in the polar bear's case, obviously the ice sheet's receding, it becomes harder to hunt, and therefore we're going to lose polar bear populations. Now the problem with this is that, I mean, the polar bear they took a picture of had nothing to do with global warming. Now, apparently, I mean, they don't even know, but most likely the bear is just an old bear, or it could also be very sick, because right now in the areas where they took that picture, the polar bear populations are actually increasing, and there is plenty of healthy, fat polar bears walking around. But once again, if you have what I'm going to call later on the environmental filter on, or the global warming filter on, everything you see is going to confirm that global warming is a big problem and something needs to be done about it. So if you show a picture of just a bear that happens to be sick, that can be used to confirm your bias about global warming. It's not rational, but once again, 90% of the time, we're not rational either. Next, we need to talk a little bit about mass delusions. Now, I've already gone over mass delusions to some extent in a previous video I did on net neutrality, but nonetheless, I just want to kind of go over it briefly because I think it's going to be useful. So a mass delusion is when a population collectively experiences an imaginary threat or irrational belief. They are the norm of humanity, not the exception. And again, mass delusions are kind of an outgrowth of the persuasion filter, which states that most people are irrational 90% of the time. And therefore, people as a group are irrational 90% of the time. And that's why you can have events happen such as this. There are so many examples of mass delusions, but this one is from what was known as the McMartin preschool trial. And what happened in the early 1980s, there was the McMartin preschool, and it was accused of sexually abusing over 360 kids. And the stories about this, if you read about it, were quite outlandish. There were stories about they had all these hidden tunnels where they would take the kids and do these unspeakable things to them, then clean them up and present them to their parents. There's also a very much a satanic cult aspect to the McMartin, or to this whole experience, and it kind of dovetailed because at that time in the early 80s, the idea of satanic cults was kind of gaining traction as a mass delusion as well as potentially the dangers of preschools. Now, this actually ended in 1990 with all the charges being dropped, because what it was found was that the investigators themselves who were investigating the case were essentially using leading questions constantly. And one thing people learned from this was that kids are much more susceptible to suggestion than adults are, although adults still are susceptible. And that's why you had this idea that 360 kids had been abused at this preschool. I mean, in retrospect, it looks insane, but at that time, when a delusion is happening, it looks very, very real. And this actually reminds me to some of the research that is supposedly done into UFO abductions. I remember seeing a film about one gentleman who does investigate it, and he's quite well known. I can't remember his name right now, but one of his ways to try and determine whether a child was taken by an alien was to kind of show random pictures and then have the alien in there, supposedly to kind of bring back repressed memories. And sure enough, a lot of times these kids have memories or repressed memories of aliens kidnapping them or abducting them. I think based on this, it is much more likely that without him knowing it, he is suggesting to the kids that the aliens are real and that they should believe it, and the kids then give back what they feel the adult wants. Some other examples of famous mass delusions that I go over in the previous video: Salem witch trials, very well known; the War of the Worlds broadcast, and Tulip Mania. And if you want to look at those ones, I talk about them in my previous video on net neutrality and mass delusions. But what I want to focus on right now, though, which might be a bit more controversial, and that Scott talks about, is the mass delusions of junk science and whether climate change, the whole study of it, actually comes under a mass delusion. Now, once again, we have to understand how people view the world. And most people see it in a 2D non-persuasion filter version. And this states that people are rational most of the time, like 90% of the time, and occasionally we're a little bit crazy. This is why when the subject of climate change comes up, when you have most scientists on one side and you're looking at things through a non-persuasive filter world, this can be quite persuasive. You're like, well, the experts say this, more than likely I'm going to go with the experts. Now, when you view things through the 3D lens or through the persuasion filter, once again, you understand that people are irrational 90% of the time, and mass delusions are common. They're not one-offs. And that, in fact, mass delusions can be extremely common among experts as well, including climate change scientists and advocates. So, with respect to climate change, what you have is incredibly complicated prediction models with lots of assumptions. And when you have lots of assumptions, you can tweak these any which way to give almost any result you want. And if you have a bias for climate change being real, that's what your models are going to show. And if you have any experience in the financial world or doing business predictions, you're likely to know that you can give your boss whatever you want. You can change a couple of things here, a couple of things there, and results will be self-confirming. And this is what I suspect is happening with a lot of these so-called climate change models. Not to mention that financial and psychological pressure to agree with the consensus is overwhelming. Governments are giving out lots of money to study climate change, and they want certain results because governments actually have their own filters. And if you disagree with it, you can be ostracized from the scientific community. And if you look up what happened to Dr. Judith Curry, for example, who was questioning a lot of the dogma of climate change, I mean, she was just ripped apart by people like Michael Mann, and including in the most sexist ways at times. So when we consider climate change, I think we have to consider just what filter the pro-global warming people are using, because I think this will give us a better understanding of what is happening. And in my mind, and I think I'm going to make a separate video on this to kind of expand on this idea, but they're using what I'm going to call the environment filter. And the environment filter is almost a way of looking at the world in a quasi-religious way, but one of its main beliefs is that Western lifestyles and capitalism are hurting Mother Earth. And therefore, you kind of have a bias towards anything that's going to reduce consumption or reduce the impact of man on the environment. Although usually this means for other people to do it, not yourself. But we'll talk about that. But this is why people who are very much worried about climate change nonetheless still oppose nuclear power and natural gas and fracking. If the 2D rational view was correct, you should be in favor of nuclear power and natural gas and fracking, because they all will make serious efforts into reducing carbon, which is supposedly what you would care about if you're being rational. However, if you're being irrational, which is I believe you're being, and you're using the environment filter, well, you want energy prices to go up. You want people, again, not you typically, to use less, to have less impact on the environment. The idea of China modernizing and everybody having cars truly scares you. And that's also why you can also have these irrational notions that you're going to be able to replace fossil fuels with solar power and wind power. And earlier I made a video about all the problems with wind power. Spoiler alert, because the wind doesn't blow all the time. And if you look at it from getting purely rational, the United States has made far more progress on reducing its carbon footprint simply by adopting natural gas, as opposed to some place like Germany, which has been setting up all these idiotic wind farms which don't always work, which is why you need to use coal, and that increases your carbon footprint, and it also makes energy much more expensive. So we have the term called energy poverty. So just based on that, I'm seeing an irrational a filter being used, which I think is quite irrational. Oh, and this is also why so often you see the biggest advocates of climate change being the biggest hypocrites. So you have Al Gore talking all the time, making movies about this, while he buys gigantic mansions and flies around in private jets. Same thing with people like Leonardo DiCaprio or a lot of the other environmental advocates. And to them it makes them feel good, but actually doing something about it, that's going to be for the little people. And this is actually very much like how religion worked maybe in the medieval years, where if you were very rich, you could pay money to the church in a form of an absolution, and then you could sin, but sin wouldn't count against you. And a lot of times people who are buying these carbon credits are doing exactly that. So again, I think one of the key aspects of this filter, which I'm calling the environment filter, is that people have a need to be part of something bigger than themselves. In the past, religion would often kind of play this part, but religion is falling by the wayside for many reasons. Nonetheless, you want to feel like you're doing good. So what better than to say you worry about climate change while not actually doing anything about it? And this is why environmental agreements, it seems to me, are almost like they're holy books. So that's why it's so important to sign these things, whether they work or not. You can go back to the original Kyoto protocols in 1997 and say, well, how effective was that? Well, they weren't effective at all. In fact, the United States, who was the only country not to sign the Kyoto protocols, once again made far more progress and actually hit the Kyoto targets as opposed to most of the countries that actually signed them. And when you're dealing with experts and junk science and the persuasion filter, this is why trained persuaders are much less impressed by experts, because they're very aware of how experts can be just as delusional as anybody else. including in large groups. So with the Paris Accord, obviously Donald Trump pulled the U.S. out of that, and everyone lost their mind. But in fact, he was quite right, and experts agree that the Accord itself was useless for lowering temperatures, and it would have been hugely expensive for the United States. And so then you have to ask yourself, if people are rational, then Paris Accords don't make any sense. But when you're wearing the global warming environment filter, then you understand why people are put all these irrational hopes onto this what is really a religious text at that point. Finally, Scott in Win Bigly has a chapter on the 2016 election and how it bifurcated reality. So during the whole election, there were actually two movies being played. One was essentially a disaster movie in which Trump was Hitler and the world was going to end if he was elected. The other movie was somewhat more of an inspirational movie with Make America Great and Drain the Swamp and that kind of thing. Now, the election actually happened. Oh, yeah. And the interesting thing about this is that people can have these very different movies in their heads and yet still function in the real world. People can go to movies, people can shop and go to grocery stores, go to the jobs, even though the views of reality are completely different. Now, when the election actually happened and Trump was elected, to literally half the country, they had the disaster movie in their heads. So to them, Trump was Hitler, and with cognitive bias, that would keep them there, unless President Trump, being a persuader, could start to kind of bring them away from that movie and perhaps show them a different movie. And so what could Trump do? Basically, if you think Trump's Hitler, the thing you have to do is just do things that are very un-Hitler-like. So, for example, at one point during the campaign, he was talking about mass deportations, and he scaled that back to merely deporting illegals who had committed serious crimes. If you think Trump is going to be a dictator, well, the way to counteract that is to allow Congress to do their work and to allow the courts to do their work. And that's what happened when he was working on his immigration ban on certain countries that were deemed hazardous. He also dropped support of waterboarding and actually going after the families of terrorists. Again, he's walking back a lot of these Hitler-esque things, I suppose. He also ordered a tomahawk strike on Syria, and again, when that happened, you may even disagree with that action, but to a lot of people, that was a presidential move, and people from both sides of the aisle, including his critics, said, oh, this is the day that President Trump became President Trump. The other thing he did, from a persuasion perspective, is he did what Scott calls the new CEO move. And this was critical because, as far as if you're being viewed as Hitler, you have to not only do non-Hitler things, but then replace that movie with another movie, and that's what the new CEO move was. So this is where he worked even before he was sworn in to keep Ford and Carrier jobs in the country. And what this did is this made a first impression. It was very visible, memorable, and newsworthy, and it was true to his brand. And it kind of, what it did though, is it set the tone. And so what his critics would always harp on is that, oh, not very many jobs were saved. It's a drop in the bucket. It actually cost a lot of money in subsidies, etc., etc. But none of that matters. When a new CEO comes in, especially if the company is distressed, people want to know that, oh, this new guy is going to do things a little bit different, and it's going to get results. And that's exactly what President Trump did when he saved the Ford and Carrier jobs. And you'll see this time and time again, that Trump will get the big things right, and his critics will kind of argue about the details, but still the direction that Trump is going in is one that most people can get behind. And finally, we have a persuasion tip from all of this, which is that people are more influenced by the direction of things rather than their current state. So once again, with Carrier, it kind of sent out a positive message that President Trump is going to work to bring jobs back to the U.S. and to create new jobs. The fact that at that time that wasn't happening didn't matter, but the direction is set, and that makes people very optimistic. And that's it for now. But as always, I'm curious what you think, and I'm really interested in what you might have to think about climate change and what I'm calling the environment filter. Like I say, I find this idea quite interesting, and I'm probably going to do a bigger video on it. So stay tuned for that. But as far as the next video I'm going to do, Scott's going to be talking about hypnosis in Win Bigly, and I think that's going to be very interesting as well. So stay tuned for that. So that's it for now, and as always, I just want to thank you for watching and commenting, and until next time.